This episode of Strictly Speaking with Bob Frantz is brought to you by Get More Tank. What is it? Get More Tank is a fuel catalyst that's going to save you money every single month on gas. Get More Tank is a tablet with active ingredients that add big mileage to every tank. Made in America, the Get More Tank formula has been used for decades by trucking companies and heavy industry. Now the Get More Tank formula is available to people like you and me. Get More Tank works in any gas or diesel engine, cleans your engine, lowers emissions, and you'll feel improved engine performance every time you step on the gas. Get More Tank works for cars, trucks, boats, motorcycles, four-wheelers, mowers, and blowers, contractors, electricians, plumbers, painters, lawn service companies. Get More Tank is going to save you money and extend the life of your engines. If you're an owner-operator running your rig around town or across the country, Get More Tank is going to save you money too. A 5-pack on sale only at getmoretank.com for just $22 plus shipping. Use promo code Bob and get 10% off of that. Save your money and get better engine performance at getmoretank.com. That's getmoretank.com. Welcome, everybody, once again to Strictly Speaking here on True Blue. I'm Bob Frantz. It's good to have you with us. We have a fascinating conversation today waiting for you. William R. Forstchen holds a Ph.D. in history from Purdue University with a specialization in military history. He's also the author of over 40 books, several of which have been New York Times bestsellers. His groundbreaking novel happened about 14 years ago, in 2009, when he wrote 1 Second After. Credited by many with being integral to the start of the prepper movement by raising national awareness of the potential threat of an electromagnetic pulse strike. This is something that I'm going to be 100% honest with you, terrifies me. It terrifies my wife when somebody comes on TV talking about EMPs. Turn it off. I don't want to think about it. That's how devastating this is. Well, Dr. Forstchen is also the author of another book about another threat that we should be concerned about coming from the Middle East. The military situation in the Middle East, of course, has deteriorated since the time of ISIS to the point where now Hamass is being regarded as worse than ISIS, recently having committed the most atrocious attack on Jews since the Holocaust when they struck Israel. At any rate, Dr. Forstchen believes it's time America took serious note of the threats coming from terrorist groups in the Middle East. We might be their next target, and who knows, could those two terrible things come together? An EMP from the Middle East, or in addition to the tensions in the Middle East. At any rate, let's welcome Dr. Forstchen to Strictly Speaking. Now, Doctor, it is so good to have you here with us on True Blue. How are you this afternoon?
Very good. And thank you for that opening monologue, because you really capture the threat of the moment. It's both EMP, possible terrorist situations. We're in a precarious situation at this moment.
We are, and I meant every word that I said about the threat of it. I am loosely acquainted with some of the specifics about what an EMP can do, but I don't know nearly enough, which is why I want to talk to you. And I'm hopeful that my wife will watch this when it airs, because and I mean this, she's not a Chicken Little scream. Oh, and nor should anybody who is familiar with EMPs be Chicken Littles and talk about the sky is falling. It really could be falling. I mean, I want to just throw some things out, Doctor, before you tell us specifically what an EMP is. But at the end of the day, no power, no heat, no electricity, no water supply, no transportation, no access to medications or medical care. Even if you could get those things, you couldn't pay for it because no access to money. Complete devastation of our entire way of life. It sounds like a horror movie, and it is, except it's something that isn't Hollywood based. It could be reality based. I don't think I'm overstating that, right?
Well, let's do a 1-minute primer. EMP stands for electromagnetic pulse weapon. It's generated by detonating a small nuclear weapon, 60 to 80 kiloton, about 4 to 5 times the size of a Hiroshima bomb, 200 miles above the United States. It sets up an electrostatic discharge that's called the Compton, Compton, Compton effect. Hits the Earth's surface, feeds into the millions of miles of electrical wiring, which act as antennas, and it starts shorting the entire power grid off. Worst case scenario, 3 such weapons, eastern, central, western United States, they would shut down America's power grid for months, perhaps even years. According to two congressional studies, we could lose 80 to 90% of our population within 1 year after such an event. It is catastrophic. It throws us back into the Middle Ages.
Did I hear that number right? 80 to
Yes.
90% of the population, or a population of what?
Well, let me.
Go ahead.
Okay, you're located where again?
Cleveland, Ohio,
Okay, where'd you get your water this morning?
right out of the tap.
Right, that miraculously appears out of our taps. It's called expectation and normalcy. Work yesterday, work today, work tomorrow.
Mhm.
But if the electrical grid, the fundamental building block of our society, goes out, you've lost your water. Within days, you're going to have chaos in cities. 20 days food supply, average town. That goes offline. Medication, you can't get it anymore, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It starts a cascading effect that indeed, you think about it, it could kill upwards of 80% of Americans within a year. No water, no food, no medication, no transportation, and no command and control. Chaos follows.
Yeah, I believe every bit of it. That's the reason I kind of laid all those things out of there. Again, having been a little bit familiar with you and with your work on EMPs. So tell me, who is developing these? What countries today are capable of building an EMP and carrying out an EMP strike that would have the devastating impact you described?
Anybody who has a nuclear weapon. It was first truly realized in 1962 when we detonated a 1 megaton warhead out in the Pacific. And at the burst of the weapon, it shorted out power grids in Hawaii, 400 miles away. Russians did it the same year in what's called Soviet Test 184. Anybody who has a nuclear weapon can generate an EMP if you can get it out into space. My biggest concern, North Korea or some third world player like ISIS or Iran getting a nuclear weapon and simply lofting it above us.
How many nuclear nations are there that we know that have capabilities?
I think it's 7 or 8. Uh, China, Russia,
Russia.
North Korea, India, Pakistan, Israel, France, Britain, and us
Okay.
that we know of.
Okay. So we'll talk more about what nations might have a reason to do this because we're in a
Yes.
constant geopolitical war already with
Hmm.
most of the nations you just mentioned, maybe with the exception of Israel. We're in some
Hmm.
capacity in some sort of conflict with Pakistan, always obviously with Russia. Might not be classified as a Cold War anymore, but of course with their incursions into Eastern Europe and starting those kind of things. China, of course, is our number one. Why haven't any of them threatened those kinds of things? We always hear about the
Good.
threat of a nuclear power detonating an actual nuke, a Hiroshima type of atom bomb, or now a hydrogen bomb or whatever, nuclear bomb. But we don't hear the threat of ESP being bandied about by those who wish to intimidate the United States.
Very good question. Well, when it comes to Russia and China, we go all the way back to the 60s. It's called mutual assured destruction. They do us, we do them. Nobody wins. My big concern are the third world players, North Korea in particular, that does have intercontinental capability and also nuclear weapons, and possible terrorist states being handed off with a weapon. According to some people I've talked to within the last week, Iran might already have a bomb. We're not sure, but do you want to play the game of doubt whether they do or not? That's a tricky question because if you miscalculate on this, it's a game over for the United States. Truly a game over.
I'm trying to figure out if there's a way someone might want to use an EMP and do all of the devastating things you just described on a smaller level so that it doesn't assure mutual destruction. In other words, is there an EMP strike that could say cripple an American city, a major American city, one that didn't destroy the country, as you pointed out, in which case we launch back and destroy all of theirs, but it's something that is it's a more of a precision strike that shows this is what we can do.
That would be difficult by the nature of the weapon itself. It's a nuclear weapon. It's a line of sight event, meaning you have to get it above the Earth's atmosphere to lay down a broad area. A localized, yeah, there are EMP generators, but they're very, very limited in capability, a block or two. So you go from that or to a full scale situation. It's a kind of a gray area in between. I can't answer if there would be such a precision weapon. I hope not. I just hope not.
Yeah, I do too. What about us? What are our capabilities? And is it something
Oh,
what is it something that, actually twofold question. Well, let's stick with this one first. Is it a part of our arsenal in the United States military, the United States, capability to say to another country that is doing horrific things that may involve us, that hey, you don't have this capability, but we do. And again, I'm not talking about nuclear power to nuclear power, where it's mutual assured destruction, but to another country. Is that something that we would or could use, as an intimidation tactic?
well, that's a great question. The problem with that is it requires to really generate an EMP, you need a nuke.
Mhm.
That's breaking an 80-year since Hiroshima in 45. No one has used one. Who's going to let the genie out of the bottle? Now, the problem is once the genie is out of the bottle, then the taboo is off and other nations may use it. So it's a very precarious situation to be in. Do we have the capability? Oh yeah, we have it 1,000 times over. But do we want to use it? Again, that lets the genie out of the bottle. Just a quick example. In my book, 1 Second After, at the very end of the book, I have my main character talking with a military person who said, yeah, it was North Korea who did the EMP. Boy, we flattened them. To which my main character replies, does that change anything for us now? 90% of us are gone. What difference does it make? You see the point?
I do. And, when I say used to intimidate, because we are the only nation to have used and detonated nuclear weapons in the form of
Mhm.
the atom bombs, we would be the ones that would be most likely to be believed. In other words, we could enforce our will around the globe if we wanted to, because we not only have the capability, like you said, maybe only six or seven other nations out of the 200 in the world do, but we're the only ones who have pulled the trigger before. You would think that it would be something that would be to our advantage. Again, if we get threatened with a military conflict with China, for example, they got 1 billion people over there, 80 to 90% of them being, uh, you know, uh, killed in such a strike would be an extraordinary number of people. My point is, we have used it before. We don't use it and the threat of it, though, to our advantage. Is that because of mutual assured destruction you referenced?
Mutual assured destruction, and our policy has been for almost 80 years no first use.
No first
No
use.
first use. America will not use a nuclear weapon first. It's a moral decision we have to make because of the catastrophic possibilities that can come out of it. So it limits us. I think rightly so. We should never use nukes first. But regarding the current situation of Iran, if we spun off in a direction on that in this interview, there's a hell of a lot we could do right now to put Iran in its place.
Yeah, that's a very
Do we
good
have the
point.
will?
That's a very good point. We'll
Right.
we'll come back to Iran, and we'll come back to the Middle East situation. But speaking specifically to you continually refer to it as a nuke because it takes a nuclear explosion for it to the strike to happen. I get it. When we think of nuclear bombs now, though, we think of just the catastrophic mushroom cloud, the massive,
Mm-hmm.
heat, that just explodes all
Scorcher.
around.
Yeah.
Yes, and then of course the radiation and the fallout thereafter and so forth. Which is more devastating, that or I mean, do we get radiation with an EMP? Do we have the same type of thing, or is it more just it strikes the grid and then we're just left to fend for ourselves?
Radiation from a nuclear weapon fallout is created by doing a ground burst that throws hundreds of thousands of tons of dust up into the atmosphere, radiating it, and then it gets blown downstream.
Hmm.
Uh, an EMP, you're doing this out in space. Let's say it happened right now, and you're looking at the window, you would see a bright flash of light, not even to the point that it would blind you. It might dazzle you a little bit.
Hmm.
No sound, nothing, but then the grid goes off. But there isn't the radioactive fallout that we would assume would happen if we did a city buster.
Okay. So when I ask which is more devastating, the answer is maybe neither. They're pretty much the same, but just in different ways. One is more of an instantaneous death plus the fallout factor after. The other one is going to be that year of no supplies and so forth, everything that we rattled
Yeah.
off.
I would highly recommend to your listeners and you personally, check out a British movie made in the 1980s called Threads. Threads. It's an hour and a half long. It is about what would happen in England in the event of a nuclear war. And the opening move in that battle is an EMP over Sheffield, England, and over Eastern England. I highly recommend it. It's chilling, though. Do not let your wife see it because you won't get any sleep for the next month.
Well, it's funny because again, what her biggest fear is what you describe with an EMP more than the traditional nuclear bomb, which again, if you're lucky, you're vaporized in a millisecond and you don't even know what
Yeah.
happened. But it's that extended death and that knowledge that you're inexorably marching towards something you cannot stop. That's what terrifies her, and I'm sure millions of other people once they become educated on what an EMP can do. So, I want to ask about preparation. I saw an interview you did back in February, and you referenced the fact that right now, under the current administration, we are doing no prep whatsoever for the event of an EMP strike. We used to do it. We were doing it in the previous administration. I don't know how far back that goes that we started this, but we're not doing it now. Can you expound on that?
That's these are really good questions today. I'm enjoying this interview. Um, Under the previous administration, the Trump administration finally mandated the DoD, DOE, and others to do an evaluation of how we can ameliorate a EMP strike. The current administration killed that mandate on the first day of that administration. We're spending over $1 trillion on so called green energy, but we're not spending money on the nuts and bolts. You can upgrade power grids to withstand an EMP, but it will cost money. Not $1 trillion. I hear figures around 50. What's 50 trillion billion dollars today anyhow? It's chump change almost. We could be hardening the grid, putting in better computer components, circuit breaking systems and such. And a key thing, stockpiling key components of our electrical grid in times of emergency. Where are 90% of our key components manufactured today?
Where are 90% of them manufactured?
Yeah,
In China.
take a guess.
Well, most of them are
Of
in China.
course,
Yeah.
of course. The analogy I give there is imagine it's December 7th, 1941. Joint Chiefs are meeting with the president, and one of the generals says, Mr. President, we got a problem. All our aircraft carriers are made in Japan. All our airplanes are made in Germany. What are we going to do? We had a homegrown industry that won from the defeat of Pearl Harbor. 44 months later, we were dictating peace in Tokyo Bay. We don't have that homegrown industrial capacity to quickly replace, or better yet, stockpile emergency components. Our electrical grid is basically, you could say, running naked. It's a barely held together system that's getting maxed out.
So when you talk
It's
about
a
hardening it,
sad in and of itself.
so when you talk about hardening
Big
it, what does that mean? What does that look like? Is there any quote unquote strengthening of the grid or hardening of the grid that
Oh,
would that
yes.
would withstand an EMP strike?
Well, the problem is the level of what's called volts per square meter with an EMP strike. But even a basic hardening up, which would include more robust wiring system, particularly circuit breakers on shorter relays, SCADAs, computer replacements that are they're hardened and such, and then again stockpiling key components that might short out. We're not doing any of that. That's scary to me.
So I want to try to understand this a little bit more. The
Sure.
EMP is detonated, you say, in space, within our atmosphere or outside of our atmosphere?
200 miles out. The upper atmosphere still affects up even at the space station, but it's above 99.99% of the atmosphere. That creates the ideal situation for the electrostatic burst.
Okay, which is the reason why I was asking about hardening the grid. I mean,
Yeah.
it's detonated, whatever distance you say, up out of the atmosphere. It impacts everything that we have now, every circuit and every electric and
Full
electronic.
wave. Yeah,
completely.
within line of sight.
But so
Within line of
within
sight of
line of
the
sight, within line of sight. Got it.
yeah.
So I'm wondering, do we rewire and rebuild or prepare the backup grid underground so there is no line of sight? Can that be done in underground
Doesn't work.
tunnels, caves, bunkers, and so forth? That if something happened up top, we activate what's beneath. That doesn't work.
Even underground cabling systems will get fed through by the connecting points. When Soviet Test 184 happened in 62 or early 63, one cable system 400 miles long fed the overburst into a power station in Kazakhstan and blew it out. So it still feeds there. Yeah, we could harden, bury deep, etc. But do you realize the cost of that? That will
Well, you
finally run
mentioned it
into the
yourself,
trillion.
$1 trillion on green energy nonsense they're doing now. I mean, and besides,
Yeah,
we're 33 trillion in debt right now. We're giving away about half a billion to
oh,
Ukraine at this moment. I mean, we're on our way to that number. I mean, I kind of feel like most Americans, in the interest of national survival, and I don't mean as the nation, but the individuals that make up the nation, would say, if my taxes are going to that, I'm okay. Let's go ahead and do something like that. I, I,
it can help a lot. But
yeah.
yeah, it's insane, isn't it?
Well, yeah,
It's
well, it
absolutely
is,
insane.
which is why I asked you to get more specific on what the last administration. And by the way, what was the first administration to start preparing for a potential EMP strike?
There's an amusing story. The Kennedy administration, when they put in our first level ICBMs
Hmm.
in Montana and elsewhere, they were shielding the wires. This is the old days of really shielding it because these were nuclear weapon sites. About a year later, it all started going offline. They dug the cables up. Gophers were delighting and eating the damn cables. And they were shorting out a fair part of our nuclear defense system in the early 60s.
Wow.
So we have tried at different points. Here's a good chiller for you. We upgraded Air Force One some years ago to withstand, and you want that one to withstand along with Looking Glass, the nuclear fighting command post. But I was just told last week by a good friend who knows his stuff, says it's doubtful that they would survive a high level EMP now because you can keep jacking up the intensity of burst per square meter. The higher the intensity, the more probability something will short off.
I'm just curious. This is totally an aside because I'm picturing
No, no,
the explosion in space as you talk about affecting everything line of sight. Does it go up as well? And I don't know how high up the International
yes,
Space Station is, but would it do that as well and wipe out all of the tech
yeah,
and satellites?
it would short out a hell of a lot of our satellites as well.
Okay. So,
And think about losing all our GPS satellites.
oh gosh, you can't fathom it. Again, that's one of the other things you can't fathom when you talked about just the ability to get your water supply, which of course goes down as well.
Yeah,
Anything that's pumped.
yeah,
So they started being concerned about this in the 60s during the Kennedy administration, but were advances made during Carter and during Reagan and during, over the course of the 90s and so forth? Did anybody, did the federal government dedicate resources to specifically researching EMPs and how to withstand one?
tell you a wonderful story, true story. It's not apocryphal. Uh, Early around 2000 or so, uh, government DoD took about 50 cars. They want to see just what would happen in transportation grid to short it out. So you can make an EMP generator, to do things like testing and all that. They have a big facility out in Albuquerque, and they kept jacking up the volts per square meter, and finally some of the cars shorted off. They stopped the study. The reason being, these were rental cars, and they had to return them. That's the
Are you
level of
kidding?
thinking.
That's the reality.
I'm not kidding you. It's not apocryphal.
They
That's a true
stopped that
story.
research because they were rental cars that had to be turned back in.
They didn't take 50 government issued cars that have been taken off the line and do it that way. That that shows you how bizarre DoD can get at times.
Yeah, it sure does. So, um, I want to talk about the sustainable development movement. Let's talk about the green, energy movement. Some will say there's a reason why we have to wean ourselves off of combustion engines and everything else anyway, and we need to
Mhm.
use windmills, and we need to shut down factories, and we need to go back to using natural elements and these kind of things. Are they onto something there that we don't know about, or would that all be wiped out or ground to a halt as well? Um, Factory farming, things of that nature. You're going to have to go back to just eating plants. These are things that would withstand, I guess, an attack on our electrical grid and all of our power grids and everything else. It's almost like going back to the foundation and the formation of the country, where everything is going to have to come from the earth. Is that a sustainable, or rather a survivable method?
I don't think so. Let's take just the example of sustain, and I do support some of the sustainability aspects. To get all the wiring for a large solar farm, all that wiring can be vulnerable, and in the end, it has to pump into the grid anyhow. Windmills. Starting to find out windmills have a very short life expectancy.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than being 20 to 25 years, they're going down in 3 to 5 years. From there, they still have to be wired back into the grid. Again, vulnerable. So we are getting some aspects, certain military bases are basically cutting the wires offline to be an internal powered system that is highly resistant. That is working for certain military bases, and yeah, and even for individuals. That is working.
That's important. That's and because that's one of the questions I was going to ask you is whether it's the solar panels, like you said, if they're connected and wired, then they're going to get hit. They're going to be disabled, just like everything else is. But why can't we, or can we build? And I don't care if it's the windmills and the solar panels and so forth, and store them unconnected, disabled, not connected to
Yes,
already,
I'm
and
connected.
or any of the existing electrical devices, all of the what are we calling them, uh what is being actually wiped out by the pulse, what is being wiped out by the pulsation.
The problem is that, okay, as you invest into, let's say, a sustainable system,
Mm-hmm.
but keep it offline, you're making an investment that you might not get a cash back on for years and years. The tendency is going to be, well, if we made it, why don't we plug it in? We can always pull the plug if there's an emergency.
You mean kind of like we do with the strategic oil reserve, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
we hold it for an
Oh,
emergency.
yeah.
Just
Yeah.
in dire emergency, and then we use it because prices went up a little bit, so we're going to have to.
Yeah. Well, we can drop the price of gas five
Yeah,
cents. The strategic reserve for oil, I think, is at its
but if we did
lowest in
have the
decades.
discipline, doctor, if we did have the discipline to let that strategic petroleum reserve sit, to let the massive numbers of diodes and electrodes and switchers and everything that it takes to run the country via its power grid now, if we sat them in boxes and buried them underground, and they can withstand, well, not they could, well, they would be able to withstand because there's no line of sight and they're not connected to wiring up top that would go underground. We could just rebuild, perhaps within that year that you talk about. It would take 80 to 90% of the population to die.
But do remember, I would say the overall cost of our entire grid is most likely in the tens of trillions of dollars. It's been invested on for the last 130 years. Part of the problem there is that of the electrical grid itself, the average component, according to DOE, is 60 to 70 years old. We're pumping electricity with systems made in the 60s and 70s. They're antiquated, they're aged. You talk to people who actually work on the line, I mean, actual linemen, and they're saying, this thing is held together with spit and prayer.
Mm-hmm.
So if we're making a replacement system, but then not plugging it in, that would be a very interesting political situation to try and convince people we're doing this as strategic reserve
Right.
in case something does happen.
And I would,
It's an interesting
yeah,
proposition I've not heard of before.
yeah. Well, again, we can sit here and be terrified, which we should be, of these things. And I think your book certainly
Mhm.
illustrates that. And by the way, 1 second after immediately every time I see it and I think about your book, and we could throw that book up, title up on the screen there too. It was written 14 years ago, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But reminds me of another 80s movie. You mentioned Threads. I remember The Day After. Was that kind of a little bit about what yours was based upon, the nuclear fallout from The Day After?
Did you remember in The Day After where Jason Robards is trying to get back into, I think it's St. Louis, and there's suddenly an airburst, which was an EMP because remember his car and everybody else's car shut down.
Yes.
That's one of the few films I've seen that accurately shows what would happen. A full-scale nuclear exchange, most likely the first half dozen warheads would be airburst far above the continent to blind us and then hit us with the rest of the bad stuff.
Okay, so there was
So
there was kind of an inspiration. I actually
that's one
saw
of the
that
better
movie in
ones.
high school. We watched it in one of my social
Yeah.
studies classes. They actually showed us The Day After, and it was terrifying. We were talking about it after school. We were talking about the next day. It's like, oh my gosh. Uh,
Oh yeah.
so when we think about the devastation of such a thing, which we saw there, and you talk about here, what more could we possibly, what would be more important for us to possibly invest all of our tens of trillions of dollars in than a way to come back from that, even if it's on a much smaller scale? As you say, tens of trillions, that's to build the grid we have now, which is optimal. Everybody's got fiber optic cables, we've got satellites, we've got feeds coming into our phones, and so on and so forth, but just a survival grid. While we then take the decades that it took to build what we have now over time, can we at least store enough stuff for survival? Is kind of what I'm going for here. Whether it, again, be
You know,
underground bunkers and so forth.
again, another great question because I call it lifelines of recovery that you cannot replace the entire grid in a year or two. It would take an effort of at least 20
Yeah,
years.
sure.
But, okay, here in Western North Carolina is my example. If we started investing in what I call lifelines of discovery, very hardened, up to date electrical grid, just a line, for example, from the power plants near Charlotte to a couple of lines come up here to Asheville. The grid goes off, but those lifelines stay. Do you know how crucial that could be in our recovery? Because you would still have computers working here, distribution, things like that. Just some lifelines of recovery that would cost maybe 20, $30 billion a year just to begin some basic lifelines. But more importantly, would be also the stockpiling of crucial components. Right now, take a large transformer just to replace one takes 2 years. From the time we order it from China until it's finally rolling down the interstate to your power plant.
Well, you bring up China again there, and how we are so beholden to
Yep.
them for so many things. So if they created a cabinet position for EMP preparation director or secretary, and Dr. William Forstchen was fortunate enough to get through the Senate confirmation hearings, and you're advising the president,
Yeah.
what are you doing? What's your first order of business to prep for such a thing?
I know of only one candidate in the past 20 years who has declared that EMP would be his number one security issue. That's my friend Newt Gingrich. It was Newt, in fact, who turned me on to writing a book about it over 20 years ago. Now, I was already aware of the issue of EMP. He was the one that was advising me. We need to get a popular book out there to explain EMP to the general population. If we had a president who said this is a top priority, I would start to breathe a little bit easier, followed by proper education of the public. We need some good old fashioned PSAs that start explaining to people what an EMP is. Now, a lot more people know it now than when my book came out, but there's a heck of a lot of people who still don't even understand the
What would that
basics.
change, though, doctor?
Get them educated.
What if they're educated? What
What?
would that change? Because, I mean, I'm relatively educated about it. I'm asking you so that I can become more educated about it, and hopefully everybody who watches this is as well. But again, talking with this sort of thing over with my wife, we talk about, okay, we're aware of it. We know what the devastation would be. Now, are we working on storing seeds? Are we working on planting crops? Are we working on buying territory so that
Yep.
we can? It looks like you've got guests. Um, Are we doing something? Are we digging wells so that we can have our own water supply? No, we're not doing those things. Are we going to breed horses so that we have transportation once the automobiles are completely disabled? We're not. I don't know anybody else who probably would, other than existing ranchers and farmers. I don't know anybody who would be prepared, even if we were more educated. So it's got to go more than that. We got to do more than just tell people about it. What can be done to save their lives?
You got maybe 1% of the population is what I would now call true survivalists. The people who are buying the land, digging the wells, and everything else. I'd say maybe 10% are preppers in certain ways. Now, to the average person, even now, somebody listening to you who's never really thought about it, putting a month or two of emergency food supplies into your house is a no brainer. Whether they live in Florida, or there's hurricanes, or they live in a safe place like I do in the mountains of Western North Carolina. Just getting some basic supplies on hand for the average person. But we also do need, I'm finding more and more it's states that are starting to take action. I'm just praying November next year, we get a government that finally starts taking this really seriously and does a bit of almost like a Marshall Plan to bring this grid up to a properly secure, because once it's secure, that lessens the probability somebody's going to do it. When we're insecure, that increases tremendously the possibility that somebody's going to do it. Somebody's going to do it.
So, a couple follow-ups.
Sure.
10%, the 10, I think you said. Let's say 20%. Let's say 20% of the population preps. They're preppers. They're digging the wells. They're doing everything.
I'm sorry, somebody's crashing.
Yeah, I see that. You have some guests in the.
Oh, my dog's crashing.
Yeah, that's all right. So
it's time to play ball.
Let's say that 10 to 20% of the preppers out there, they are going to be immediately targeted by 80% of people who have nothing. Chaos,
yes,
mass attacks, and scrambling, and the worst of mankind, I think, to try to get whatever resources were saved up by the preppers. Second Amendment rights, of course, are always under attack in this country right now. I'm trying to figure out how even the 10 to 20% survive an EMP, given the fact that the 80% who are about to die will do anything to save their own lives.
Well, it's type of moral questions I ask. You're living in a city and you have 2 children and they haven't had a drink of water in 3 days, 4 days. And you see somebody with a 6-pack of water. How far are you willing to go to get 2 of those cans for your or bottles for yourself?
Right.
You haven't eaten in a week. How far are you willing to go? The breakdown of a society can come very, very quickly. The larger the social group, meaning large cities, it'll be almost instantaneous. In my novel, I deliberately choose my hometown, a small town, 5,000 people, that keeps some semblance of social order while trying to figure out how to keep people alive. Once you get much beyond that, 30, 40, 50,000 people, it just all starts to break down. That is the terrifying part. We will turn on each other, and we will turn on each other in a very violent way. Even remember the movie with Jason Robards, where the one farmer guy just blows him away at the end. Just blows him away. He's just trying to ask a question of him, gets shot.
Right.
These things will become the norm. And that's scary.
Yeah, most Armageddon movies, end of the world movies, apocalyptic movies, and so forth, they end up that way. The main characters are being attacked by the swarms. First of all, they have to deal with the threat to the end of the world that is there, and then they have to deal with their fellow humans trying to survive the threat to the end of the world. And that's one of the things that we have to consider here. So I want to add another element to this now. We sit here 14 years after you wrote 1 Second After, a little bit of a different world with the evolution of AI, artificial intelligence. We are becoming more and more and more reliant upon the power grid and the digital world and so forth than ever before. All of that would be wiped out. But can we, Dr. Forstchen, Secretary of EMP preparation in the next administration, Forstchen, can AI be used to find solutions and other ways to harden the grid to protect itself, which then by extension protects us?
It's an interesting question I never thought of. Maybe it can. Maybe it will protect itself too well. Think about that.
Well, I do. I think about that because 1984 happened and the Terminator came out, and we all talked about that. We
Yeah,
all, but I
yeah.
mean, quite literally, can it be programmed with all of the thinking we're teaching computers to do now? And at the end of the day, I still go back to, the age old when the computer age started, GIGO, garbage in, garbage out. It's going to give you whatever you give it.
Mhm.
But if we give it and we teach it to teach itself how to protect itself from whatever threats there might be, including something like an EMP. I'm just wondering if we can't use that technology to aid mankind as opposed to, the digital bots taking over.
Maybe you've given me the subject of my next book.
Okay.
Sure, but
Okay.
because when I started this series, AI was just a distant on the horizon. Let's not worry about it now. It's becoming a reality.
Yes, it is.
Uh, we look at the dystopic side of AI. Maybe there's a positive side to AI, except people like dystopic more than positive when it comes to their stupid stories at times.
Well, you're right about
But
that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, we tend to like to see the car wreck rather than the cars just driving on.
Do you think, Dr. Forstchen, that,
Bill, please, Bill.
okay, Bill,
Yeah.
I was asking you all about China and Pakistan, and you brought up North Korea and Russia and all these other threats. And I asked if we would ever threaten them with it. I'm not a conspiracy guy. Really, I'm not. And I'm not a boy, the government is always out to get us guy. I do have some questions about COVID and the development of those shots that they called vaccines that weren't vaccines and all kinds of things like that. But I'm just going to ask it. Do you ever think there would be a time when the government would use one of these weapons against its own people?
Unclassified, just a rumor that in 1991 we threatened Saddam Hussein with an EMP over Baghdad if he started shooting chemical weapons towards Israel, because he had them. If he had started shooting, remember the Scud War that
Yeah. Right.
happened
Sure.
when we had to postpone the ground war for about a week to hunt down the various Scuds. But I've heard several people say, yeah, we said we will EMP Baghdad if you go to chemical weapons, poison gas and such. So that never happened. That's the one case where I think it might very well have been true.
The the description you gave before, though, of the EMP taking out everything within a line of sight, and I asked you if there was a smaller version of it that could say disable an American city, but not the entirety of the land. If there isn't that, which I think is what you said, then detonating an EMP over Baghdad wouldn't just affect Baghdad; it also wipes out Israel, which we're trying to protect. Right? I
Well,
mean, the entire region.
Iran is big enough. I'm just trying to do the calculations in my head how far it is to the coast. I think it could take out Tehran and a fair part of Iran with an EMP and not affect the neighboring nations as long as they weren't in line of sight. So it'd be a low burst.
Okay, so
On
so there is a
on
little bit more precision than possible.
Yeah,
Possible.
yes,
So if you can take out Tehran and Tehran and most of Iran, but not necessarily Iraq, not necessarily Syria, the surrounding nations.
mm,
Um, Same question than I asked you before here. I mean, could you take out Chicago and a sizable portion of the Midwest without New York and LA being directly damaged?
yeah. If it was a lower burst, but what would be the motivation
Well,
of taking out just yeah,
that's a great
you
question.
know,
Again,
whereas
go ahead.
no, go on.
This is
No, you go.
conspiracy talk, and I don't like conspiracy talk, but I there are still 9/11 truthers. There are still people who believe again that COVID was intentionally created by the U.S. with the assistance of the Chinese to depopulate much of the planet, and then the creation of the forced shots and taking away people's freedoms with medical tyranny and so on and so forth. People are willing to accede to whatever a government wants when the threat is large enough. And people
Yes.
voluntarily rolled up their sleeves. They voluntarily said, I'll take the jab over losing my job. I'll do what the government tells me to do if it means my survival. So, what would be the motivation of one city or one region of the country, but not the entire thing? To make the rest of the country fall in line. That's why. And again, that's all very
Okay.
conspiratorial, but that's just what I'm asking.
Well, you think of human nature in Germany in the 30s, all those who were willing to march along with it,
Yeah.
or even worse, the Soviet Union or China. I mean, China, about 60 million people died during the great cultural revolutions of the 50s and 60s in the agrarian revolution. Everybody was still chanting Mao's name. I don't know. You left me a bit puzzled on this one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, we have had throughout, if you talk about human morality, the value of life, and so on and so forth, or we can go back into ancient times, we have always been
Mhm.
willing, or there have always been people willing to commit genocide, to wipe out entire populations just to expand empires. Not suggesting that we are an imperialist, type of nation that would want to expand our quote unquote empire, but you understand my point. Human beings are capable of some extraordinary things, and mass death on massive scales that were prior to those times never before heard of, and they did them. And now we've seen some things, in our lifetimes, well, we probably never would have even thought of being possible, and yet here we sit. So that's the reason for just one.
Dresden.
The most, and again, not to be very, very cliche here, but absolute power, corrupts absolutely. Those with the most ability to do the most damage are the ones that are going to do the most damage. That's why I brought it up. We're the most powerful nation in the history of the world, and the only ones ever to use an atomic weapon or a nuclear weapon. And so you just kind of wonder, at what point does human nature, the dark side of human nature, take over and put us all at their, under their heel.
Remember Dresden,
Sure.
Tokyo, 150,000 people in one night. And at that point, we were willing to accept that many civilian casualties to push that war through. Uh, Incomprehensible to us 5 years earlier. If we had
Right.
said in 1939, you're going to firebomb a city in one night and kill 150,000 people, it would be only the Nazis would do that.
Right. That's exactly right.
So
But of course, the goal
it's a
there is
tale we
the goal
learn.
there is the greater good. We know we're going to
Right.
sacrifice innocents, but it's for the greater good. We know we're going to kill tens of thousands in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but it's going to end a war that could kill a million. So better,
Yes,
greater
exactly.
good. What I'm talking about, though, and I think what anybody who would consider the kinds of things using an MP would do would be just the opposite. It's not for the greater good. It's for the more. It's because what good comes from that? It's for the full control, tyrannical control, dictatorial, authoritarian control of the people. It's for the exact opposite. But okay, speaking of
Right.
dictatorships and tyranny and so forth, let's go into the Middle East. Your other book, or one of your many other books that I want to talk about, is Day of Wrath, because you wrote that book, and I'll let you kind of give people a summary of it before I ask my first question. Let's talk about Day of Wrath.
1914, excuse me, 2014, um, early summer that year, that's when ISIS cut loose. Uh, After a couple of days of the purported executions or the still photos and everything else, I dug in on the websites and I finally got ISIS feeds. I wish I hadn't. I was watching the most horrific things possible. Uh, a 12-year-old boy sawing a man's head off and then turning the head backwards and snapping it off. This was ISIS 2014. I thought back to what was called the Breslin scenario, one in 2005. Islamic terrorists seized a school in Russia and murdered over 250 children and across the span of several days. We are wide open for that type of thing. I thought we were wide open for it in 2014 when I wrote the book. The book is premised on ISIS having half a dozen hit teams of 3 to 5 people who infiltrate small schools, not in the big cities, small schools like in Hickory, North Carolina, or Blue Eye, Michigan, or whatever, and just systematically wiping children out because so far it's always been the lone shooter. So that became the book, Day of Wrath. I wrote it in a couple of months, self-published it, became a big seller. In fact, it's even used as a training manual in some sources now.
I kind of wish you
It
hadn't
was
reminded
very
me.
disturbing.
Yeah, I kind of wish you
Beg your
hadn't
pardon?
reminded me of some of the ISIS atrocities on their
Yes.
websites, because I remember watching Nick Berg. I remember watching the pilot.
Yes,
I can't remember what nationality of the pilot who was put into a cage in the sand and burned alive. Um,
Saudi. It was a Saudi.
Saudi, thank you. It was some of the most horrific things ever, which brings me current. And the reason I brought it up is because many people are calling the Iranian backed Hamas terror organization that struck in Israel on October 7th earlier this year ISIS. Some are saying they are worse than ISIS and capable of
They
worse
are.
things. And of course, I mean, at the time of this airing, I don't know what exactly Hezbollah's role in this is going to be, but also Iranian backed and perhaps more deadly than Hamas because of their ability to use GPS guided precision strikes, missile strikes reaching anywhere in Israel. My point being, ISIS was wiped out, or was it? Was it reconstituted in the
No,
form of these other terror groups? And are we in the same place now that you were, or we were, I should say, in 2014 with ISIS and the kinds of hell that you write about in Day of Wrath?
ISIS is like a very malignant cancer that no matter how much you operate, certain parts of that are going to survive and metastasize into something else. And that is Hamas. Hamas is taking its playbook from them. I mean, we've captured training manuals, we've captured audio recordings. I mean, the Israelis have, in which they were told precisely how to execute people, burn them alive, cut their heads off, decapitate babies. That's ISIS. And my great fear here is, unlike 2014, we have such a wide open border. We don't know how many people have infiltrated into these United States in the last 2 years. I think that I would be crazy not to think that there are not terrorist cells inside the United States waiting to be given the order to go.
Um,
And realize, you go into a school. Now, I've been a professor for 30 years, high school for 10 years before that. I don't care how you arrange the school, 3 to 5 professionals hitting a school within the first minute will kill the resource officer. And unlike the lone shooter things, they will just systematically go from classroom to classroom and kill everybody. In 15 to 20 minutes, they could kill 200 children. What does that do to our country? Well, it will shut our country down. It would absolutely shut our country down in panic the next day.
yeah, I
Boy,
concur.
that would be a victory for them.
We were
Yeah,
talking about movies from the 80s, including Threads, you mentioned, and I mentioned The Day After. And I'm thinking now of late 90s, The Siege with Denzel Washington.
yeah,
Do you recall that one? There were terror strikes, like 3 or 4 terror strikes in a short period of time in New York City, which of course is always the setting for all of these things. And it literally shut everything down. That's what made me think of is what you just said. Every school would be shut down in a case like what you just described. And you talk about them doing it from within. So knowing everything that you just said to be factual, and I believe that it is, they're here. Over 9 million
yes.
illegal border crossings have taken
Right.
place in the last 2.5 years.
Take 1/10 of 1%. What's 1/10 of 1% of 9 million?
Yeah. Well, there you go. I mean, 90,000 people, and let's say half of a percent. 45,000. I mean, it took 19 to bring down the towers and the Pentagon and 93 and the whole 9 yards. So that's kind of my point. Do we need to not only seal a border or the border to stop further encroachment and the migration of terrorists into the United States on the terror watch list or not? We know we're stopping a bunch of them. There's been far more that have been stopped than before because it's being flooded. It's by sheer numbers in attrition. They're going to come all through. But do we need to start thinking about, in your opinion, and this is just all opinion, do you think we need to start think about expelling people from the country who are on student visas, who are demonstrating and showing themselves to be terrorist sympathizers? Because I don't think there is a big leap from terrorist sympathizer to terrorist. That's my thought.
Expel? Oh, I fully agree. But how the heck are you going to do it? Look at the news item just a couple of days ago. Those Jewish students who were trapped in the library at Cooper Union, New York. And the librarian said, maybe you should hide in the attic. This is Anne Frank sounding stuff.
Yes, it is.
While Palestinian protesters outside were screaming, let us in. They were going to tear them apart. We're going to expel them all? Oh, then we're violating their civil liberties. We have boxed ourselves into a corner. How are we going to expel, say, 100,000 people? Think of the civil liberties and all the ultra leftists who are you're violating our rights, blah 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 blah. And even if they did kill 1,000 children, there would still be people the next day saying, "Well, we can't violate the rights of everybody because of a few."
Yeah. And we're not talking,
Realize that
yeah,
during World War II,
we're not talking about violating rights anyway. We are talking about the fundamental right to self-defense, whether it be in this country or
right?
whether it be in Israel. Uh,
But they're going to say it's violating their rights.
of course. And what's really astounding to me when you talk about barbarism and you talked about ISIS, and this is the reason I brought the comparison to Hamas up. Um, one of the stories that I did not see it, but I heard it discussed and described by Ben Shapiro. There were videos of around a 5-year-old Israeli child whose parents were killed in front of him. They didn't kill the child though. They took the child and gave the child to a bunch of 8 or 9 and 10-year-old Palestinian children and let the Palestinian kids beat him to death. So now you're talking about whoa, the women and children they shouldn't be they shouldn't be treated the same as Hamas. Well, if they're being trained to become Hamas at a young age, you kind of feel like you might have to do that. I mean, that's an atrocity is on every bit as barbaric as what you described that you saw from ISIS.
Have you heard of a cartoon character called Farfour? Farfour.
I have.
Oh, there's an hour and 30-minute documentary. Just look up Farfour documentary.
Mhm.
This is a Hamas Mickey Mouse like character, live action, like a Barney, extolling the children to strap dynamite onto their bodies and blow themselves up. And 5-year-old children are calling and screaming and shouting and laughing, saying, "I'm going to put a bomb on me and I'm going to kill some of those damn Jews." Check it. I ask people listening to you, check out for just 15 minutes. The 3, 4, 5-year olds, when that program came out, were now the 20, 25-year olds who were massacring people in Israel 3 weeks ago. It is a plague, it's a cancer. How do you wipe it out?
So if you were to, as we talk about possible end times here, if you were to
Hmm.
handicap EMP nuclear explosion versus traditional warfare, terrorism, cellular, not cellular, beg
I
your
don't need
pardon.
your help.
You got a friend.
I
Um,
don't need our help. Okay.
but and when I say traditional too, I don't want to call terrorist cells traditional warfare either. I mean, they're not a military; they are terrorists. What is more likely to lead to World War III and the potential end of the war or end of the world? Would it be the EMP strike we first discussed, or this burgeoning crisis in the Middle East and perhaps around the world?
I would say the EMP, but remember, the plunge into chaos and madness is a downward spiral. That as each atrocity happens, you take it down another notch. Okay, I'm willing to kill them. Now they're willing to kill my children. Okay, I'm willing to kill their children. Until finally you are into Gadadameron. I would say EMP, but this war now has the potential of morphing into a very large scale Middle Eastern war with a hell of a lot of atrocities. It's a nightmare scenario, and every day I'm sitting there going, I have to stay optimist. I got to keep my optimistic side, but still, it's a frightening scenario to wake up to each morning and think about.
Let's talk about a massive war in the Middle East. Let's talk about the potential expansion of war in Eastern Europe because of course Russia being in Ukraine. And then of course let's talk about the prospects of China going into Taiwan. Everybody is wondering what will the American response to any and all of those things be? If those three things happen in three fronts, Eastern Europe, Asia, and in the Middle East, it is a world war. I don't know exactly what the outcome would be, but do you see that being, well, I mean, let me rephrase. On a scale of 1 to 10, what is the likelihood we end up in such a scenario?
High, 7 or an 8.
And in how
Remember
long?
the
In how long a period of time?
weeks or months.
Really?
Uh, remember Jack Kennedy's famous quote about It is not war by calculation that he fears. It is war by miscalculation or madness that I fear. The accidental overstep, which recall, if you look back on the history of the thermonuclear confrontation for 40 years, there are half a dozen moments there where it came within a hair's breadth of a miscalculation accelerating us into a thermonuclear exchange. Misread signals, a Soviet sub commander in 62. These are just a few of them. It is a very frightening scenario that we could spin out of control. Realize one of the greatest examples in history. Some second rate archduke goes to visit a minor city in the Balkans in 1914, gets his head blown off, and a year later, millions of men are dying in the trenches. And they're also basically the more intelligent ones are saying, what the heck are we doing here? How do we wind up as Belgians in a war against the Germans and the Turks? And no fiction writer could have written that type of scenario out and made it believable 2 years earlier. Miscalculation or madness. That's what I fear.
All right. I said that was going to be the end, but I want to, since you said what you
Yeah,
said, you think it may
keep
be,
going.
you may be weeks or months away, that kind,
Hmm.
the kind of conflicts on multiple national fronts or international fronts. If that is World War III, and it is by far the most devastating potential that we have for the United States survival, because we'd have to find a way. I mean, first, I guess we'd have to go back to the draft. We don't have anywhere near the forces necessary to fight in Europe, to fight in Asia, to fight in the Middle East. If we would fight that way at all, maybe it would be drones and precision distance strikes. I don't know. But what I'm asking is, if World War III on that scale were to break out, whether it's in 4 months or in 15 years, do you think at that point, despite our never first pledge that you brought up, it would be justifiable to eliminate one of those fronts with one of our own EMPs or a different type of nuclear device? For example, in China, we can't fight them all at once. We just can't. Just like we barely were able to stop having to fight, in the European and in the Pacific theaters in World War II. If we could just end one of them, which we did with a big blow, would that not be justifiable to do again on one of those fronts?
I was reading a very good article a couple of nights ago that in 1944, 1945, we started to contemplate the use of phosgene gas on Japan. The campaigns of late 44, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and then Okinawa, when projected forward, if we invaded Japan, was horrific. Minimum US casualties were going to be 250,000.
Yeah.
Others were saying up to 1 million. Well, what happened was by early 1945, we had stockpiled over 200,000 tons of chemical weapons. We were ready to go. Now, this was originally a counterforce to prevent Hitler, but it became more and more, if we got the weapons, let's use it. Let's just don't invade directly. Just saturate Japan with poison gas. Estimated Japanese casualties, 5 million dead. We seriously considered it. In fact, some of the people that were planning this had no idea that a nuclear weapon was being developed. Once the nukes were dropped, there was a bit of a sigh of relief. Well, we're not going to have to use poison gas. But you see my point here,
I do.
that we could easily, as this article pointed out, would this have been equivalent to 6 million Jews being gassed if we gassed 5 million Japanese to death to try and end a war?
Well,
It goes out of control.
well, yeah. I mean, and then every sentient, moral human being has to answer that question for themselves. The
Yeah.
Germans didn't do it to end a war. The Germans did it to wage war and to expand their own power. We would be doing it to end a war for future generations. So you can make the moral argument there if you want to that it would be. Now let's go back to the question that I just asked you, though, because the fact that we did use the A bombs twice. And we were very close, as you just described, using the chemical weapons and gassing 5 million Japanese. We are capable of being the most ruthless,
Oh,
even I think it's possible, I think it's possible to be righteous and ruthless at the same time here if we're
yes,
trying
so do I.
to. Pardon?
So do I.
Good. So that's kind of my
I
point
would
about
have
whether or not we would use an EMP and wreak that havoc upon an enemy in order to advance the greater good as we did in those other scenarios. Now, back to the beginning, we'll kind of come full circle on our conversation about MAD, mutual assured destruction. Help me out here. If we were to detonate an EMP over a China, for example, in a World War III type of scenario like that, would that not knock out their capability of firing one of their own? Because we have disabled all of their electronics in their grid. Would that not wouldn't that not prevent our destruction? No.
China would still have the capability anyhow to submarine launch systems, etc. China and Russia had the capacity for full retaliation. So that's a balance of terror, a quid pro quo. You do us, we do you do us, we do them. Regarding Tehran, I could see a scenario where we would do that to just simply take Tehran off the map
Mm-hmm.
because of all the terrorism that they have promoted during the years. I mean, the Tehran is behind what's happening with Hamas, ISIS. Did you see? I don't know if you saw the interview yesterday with, I believe, was the prime minister. When the interviewer got to the point of, did your people order the killing of children? And the guy just popped his microphone
Yeah.
off and said, "This is over
I
with,"
want to
and
end
he
this
got up
interview.
and walked
Yeah,
out.
he would. Yeah, I did see it.
Yeah.
I did see it. And they are.
And my sense of terminating the interview might be a bit different than just terminating the interview, if you know what I mean.
I do.
Uh, I'm I'm very pro-Israel. My mentor was pro-Israel. I grew up in a largely Jewish community when I was a small kid. Uh, I'm very pro-Israel.
Well,
Israel has to do whatever necessary to end this terror.
I do not
If that
disagree
means
one.
going in and inflicting,
I don't
it's the
disagree
same
with a
as when we hit
syllable of what you just said. I am the same way. But now I want to going again back to the principle of mutual assured
EMP.
destruction. If we were to drop one or detonate one over top, like you said, of Tehran, because of what they represent, and I agree with everything you just said, are they not part of that quote unquote new axis of evil with Russia and China? Would Russia and China retaliate on behalf of Iran against the United States and or Israel?
There was, this might sound obtruse for about a moment or so. During the Peloponnesian Wars between Athens and Sparta, the city of Syracuse asked for help, the city of Syracuse in Sicily. And about a month later, a Spartan ship pulled up, and one Spartan soldier got out, a general. And the Syracuses were going, "What the hell? We were asking for an army." And the guy just said, "Sparta is here." They won the war. He completely reformed everything. My point there is we have to send an incredibly strong message. The United States is here. Don't cross the line.
I feel that way
Tehran
too.
has crossed.
And I think
Yeah,
the answer to my
we
own
would have to make,
continue,
yeah,
please.
no. In the same way, Sparta, nobody dared to confront Sparta for the longest time afterwards because they knew what the results would be, or the Romans. Same thing. You have to make a clear statement. And I think the statement needs to be said now. Don't cross the line because
Mm-hmm.
we'll make the rubble bounce. We'll all go down together, but you will lose too.
Yep.
That's again mutual assured destruction when it comes to China and Russia. But that's what we have to do.
And that's
But
and
yeah,
that and that's
I
why
would
in
not
my
object if
hypothetical
to
and that's why in my hypothetical scenario, I don't necessarily know if the retaliation would come from their partners because they know now you're next. If we were to do Tehran like we described, China and Russia might be, oh my gosh, the Americans have got this coming now. We're not done. It's not like we only have one. If we did it over Tehran, we can do it over Moscow. And as soon as we see what you're doing, here we go, and here we go to Beijing. The point being, once we have established ourselves as being the bully of the block, if you will, even if it's in the righteous yet ruthless nature that we just described in defense of Israel, as well as our own interests, I kind of feel like they wouldn't. I kind of feel like they're like, look, these they're for
no,
real. They did it, and they will.
what is their national interest in supporting Tehran? None. I mean, screw with America.
other than their shared hatred of the West and their shared hatred of
Yeah,
the United States, really.
but there's no direct, comparable necessary thing for Russia or China to survive. Think
There's
back
not an
to Reagan
economic
and
relationship between them that would be, where of course there is with us in China and us in Taiwan and so forth. But you're right. It's just that they share the same kind of goals, um, world control in many ways, and of course the great Satan, the United States, would have to be targeted. So, but it's a fascinating thought, and I'll tell you what, Dr. Forstchen, Bill.
Bill.
You said that twice, but I'm still I'm still going to stand on title here. I respect it, so I'll say it.
Okay.
Um, the threat of an EMP should terrify people.
Yes.
I hope that people who do know, and it's a very small percentage of people who do understand the grave nature of what you're talking about. You're not just blowing smoke when you say 80 to 90%. The 80 to 90% figure of population destroyed that you talked about over the course of 1 year after an EMP is not just blowing smoke. It is reality. And so here's what I'm hoping people take away from our conversation and your continued work. And that is to get in the ears of the federal government. You said it yourself. They have done nothing to prep for a potential EMP strike since this current administration took over. So whether it's getting into their ears or the ears of the next administration, we have got to prepare ourselves because this is a more legitimate threat, I think, than to the entirety of the American population than I think anything we have ever experienced in the history of this country, or maybe the history of the world. I don't think that's overstating it. Do you?
No, I don't. I would also urge, since the federal government can be so bloody unresponsive, start on your state reps as well. If a state rep gets 30 or 40 people saying, I want the grid in my state of North Carolina to be brought up to modern scale, that works. If they get 30 or 40 people, federal government, they could get 10,000. They'll just take their bribes from the lobbyists anyhow. I'm very cynical about that. But I'm seeing, particularly in, pardon me, South Carolina, that they are starting to move to make a harder grid. There's some communities out in Kansas that are doing the same thing now. Start with your local government, prep for yourself to survive at least a couple of months, and then work towards next year's election.
Yeah.
Those are my steps.
That's a great way to close it. By the way, I hope the next time we speak, you are sitting in the state governed by Mark Robinson, but that's just my personal. Dr. William Forstchen, thank you so much for exposing the information that people need about this, and hopefully people take it to heart and the reality of the threat sets in for them. Thanks very much for your time.
And thank you for a great interview. And as always, God bless America.
Amen to that. That's going to do it for this episode of Strictly Speaking. After every episode, we do want to hear what you have to say. So leave a comment underneath this video, wherever it is that you might be watching it, on True Blue or on YouTube or any of our socials. We would like to know, are you prepared for an EMP? Will you do anything more to prepare yourself for an EMP, given what you just heard today? We'd love to carry on the conversation online. Thanks for watching Strictly Speaking. We'll see you next time.